Hello, this is John Quinlan. On this very special edition of Community Conversations, we're going to be speaking with Mandy Manning, who is the National Teacher of the Year. Mandy teaches English to newly arrived refugee and immigrant students in the Newcomer Center at Joel E. Ferris High School in Spokane, Washington. In her classroom, Mandy uses experiential projects like map making to help her students process trauma, celebrate their home countries and culture, and learn about their new community. As 2018 National Teacher of the Year, Mandy will encourage educators to teach their students to overcome their fears and seek out new experiences. We'll be speaking with Mandy over the course of an hour in the company of regular program contributor Pardeep Singh Kaleka, who will be introducing in just a moment. With any luck, we have our guest, Mandy Manning, on the line. Mandy, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
All right. Thanks so much for joining us. Mandy, I want to introduce you to a friend who has acted as both a guest and co-host. This is Pardeep Singh Kaleka. He's joining us from over in Milwaukee. Pardeep is the author of a book called The Gift of Our Wounds. And Pardeep, you may have heard of him before. About 6 years ago, there was a gun-related massacre at the Sikh temple in Oak Creek outside of Milwaukee. And Pardeep's father was a cleric who was killed in that, and Pardeep has since been an activist, a former police officer, school counselor, and many different capacities. It's kind of transformed trauma into healing, and it just resonates very deeply with your own work. So I thought it'd be great to bring him in on this conversation this morning.
Well, it's nice to meet you, Pardeep. Thank you for your advocacy and strength.
Thank you, Mandy. Yep. Congratulations, by the way. It's awesome.
Thanks.
And Mandy, you're visiting here at the UW-Madison as part of a gathering of retired Peace Corps veterans and Peace Corps members of that great group. And we're very proud here at the University of Wisconsin. I think University of Washington, Washington State, where you're from, kind of had this friendly rivalry of being the campuses that have sent the most folks into the Peace Corps. But why don't we start here? We'll get to the very powerful work you do as an advocate in Spokane, working with recent immigrant children in a high school setting. But could you reflect, for starters, on how this experience in Armenia 20 years ago as a member of the Peace Corps, working abroad, how that informs the work that you've been doing moving forward?
Well, first and foremost, the Armenian people were tremendously welcoming when I first arrived in Armenia and throughout my 2-year service. And they will always be an example to me of how we should be when newcomers arrive in our nation. So I didn't immediately work with English language learners when I became an educator in the United States. But over the years, that has been what I've ended up doing and have been doing for the last 11 years. And so I take those examples with me into the classroom. And additionally, I just remember what it felt like to adapt and to adjust to a new way of living. And the most important lesson, I think, was that there's comfort and discomfort, and that comfort and happiness don't necessarily go side by side, because you can find happiness in experiences even the most uncomfortable, especially when you're surrounded by people who are willing to help you, to take your hand, to be loving and caring and welcoming. And so in my classroom in the Newcomer Center, that's how I try to be for my kids. I welcome them. I'm excited to learn beside them and have them in my classroom, and they're such a gift.
And in that work, one of the things that's happening right now, of course, is in the national discourse, our leaders are sending really mixed messages about the immigrant experience in this country, and that can't help but to permeate, I guess, the confidence and the inner strength of these young people you work with. It's got to call into doubt, I guess, their status in the community. How do you bridge that? How how do you counter all these negative messages and give these young people a chance to feel welcome, a chance to feel affirmed in who they are?
Well, there's no doubt that the situation in our nation and the messages that are coming out of the current administration are extremely unwelcoming. So it's very important in the work that we do at the Newcomer Center up in Spokane, Washington at Ferris High School is to ensure that the kids know that they belong and that they are welcome and that we want them there. I have had kids over the years, the last couple of years especially, come to me nervous and concerned and wondering when they were going to be forced to leave our country. And so that's a very real concern for our kids. Plus, we have many children who are also concerned about their parents and possibly being forced to leave and then being separated. And so we have to be even more intentional than we have been in the past. And we've always been welcoming, but we have to be even more so now. And that means that we have to not only be welcoming in the Newcomer Center, but as a school and as a community, as a whole. And so we work extra hard to ensure that our kids feel connected not only to our classroom and to one another, but also to the students outside of the classroom. And I have to admit that as things continue to progress in the way that they have been since in the last couple of years particularly, it is getting more difficult because it's not only our students who are receiving these messages, but also students who were born in the United States. And it becomes harder and harder to teach compassion and empathy and help them make connections when all they see is disconnection and xenophobia and this, lack of wanting other people who they don't identify with in our nation. It's just getting harder and harder because this administration is a role model for everyone else. When they're not modeling welcoming behavior, it makes it awfully hard for the rest of us to press that onto our young people. And so it really takes the whole community effort. And Spokane is working on it, and we are committed, and hopefully we'll see some changes in the next couple of years.
Well, I want to come back to the nature of the Spokane community, kind of the reason why many immigrants come there. But just before I go there, of course, one of the ways that when you became Teacher of the Year, that you gathered, that folks were focused in on what you were doing, is you thought it very important on the day that this announcement was made at the White House to not be silent. You found very appropriate ways, I think, to let our current president know that that these young people whose lives you have the privilege of being a part of, how important it was to hold them up. And I know it was a time of the Women's March. It was a time you had worn a transgender support button. But you'd also shared in some basic ways kind of the story, the essence of these kids and how important it is not to denigrate them and to hold them up rather than to push them down. Could you just describe how that played out in that morning in the White House?
Yeah. So I had been approached by some community members, not in Spokane, but outside of Spokane, to consider maybe not going to the White House because they had not been welcoming to many of our kids. So I put it to my kids, and I said, what do you guys think? Do you guys think I should go or what? And they said, of course, Ms. Manning, you have to go because who else is going to tell our story? And that's when there had been a Teacher of the Year the previous year who had handed the president some letters. And I thought, I could do that too, because who better to tell my students' stories than themselves? And so the kids wrote letters. They wrote about their dreams and their ambitions and how thankful they were to be here and the journey and the struggles they had gone through in order to come to the United States and what it meant to them to be here. And they wrote those up, and I put them in a big envelope, and I delivered them to the president when I met him. I also wore pins that represented my kids, because I don't only teach brand new immigrant refugee students. I'm also a basketball coach, and I'm one of the advisors, or I was one of the advisors for the Gay Straight Alliance and also for the Writing Club. And so I have a wide cross section of kids, and that includes kids who identify as gay, straight, all of the above, cisgender, and anything that you can think. Also, I've had some transgender students. And so I wanted to make sure that they knew that in that house, the house that they did not feel welcome in, that I was standing there representing them. And then, of course, some of the letters were more pointed. And I did have one young woman from a nation in Africa. She wrote a letter that was very specific about how the president had used extremely negative and derogatory language about her nation, not only her nation, but several nations over in that region. And she said that you are a role model and people will do what you do. So she asked him to take care in his language, because she knows that people from her nation and from the continent of Africa are wonderful, beautiful people. And she asked that he be more kind in how he speak about people, because it had changed how people were interacting with her here in the United States.
Wow. So, and do you think the messages were heard on any level?
Well, I did receive a letter back that suggested that someone in the White House had read the letters. The letter was signed by the president. But I will say that words in a letter are diminished by the actions that we take. And the actions that I've seen come out of the White House, particularly since last May, have been very unwelcoming to immigrants and refugees alike, particularly children, particularly families. We're still seeing family separations. We are still seeing thousands of kids being detained in detention centers. So the rhetoric that was sent to me in the letter is vastly different than what we're actually seeing.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, Pardeep, let me just draw you into the conversation a bit. We had talked in the half hour preceding bringing Mandy on the line. Just, reflecting back to you when you were 10 years old, arriving in this country from North India, and the role that teachers played, the important role that people standing up for you and understanding what this transition was all about. Was there any reflections on that as you hear Mandy speak?
Yeah, no, there's quite a bit of reflections, and just again, thank you, Mandy, for all the work that you're doing, connecting with students. I was thinking, and I was watching the interview, and just thinking about how many different countries these students come from, and I was kind of thinking about my own. We have this program called the International Visitors Program, and last time that people came to our house, me and my wife hosted, people from Burundi, Costa Rica, Egypt, Macedonia, Sierra Leone, Thailand, Turkey, and as you go into researching a lot of, especially like where they're from, because you want to be able to connect, and it seems like you're always continuously doing research, and no, Maddie could probably, this is probably the nature of her life, is that connection requires work, and so when I'm thinking about my teachers that had this influence over my life, and really being able to develop those real relationships of trust, is to say, wow, it wasn't just a teacher who was asking me to get to know their curriculum or their subject matter. The teacher actually went out of their way to get to know me and my name and where I'm from, and that to a child is so important. And I think that's kind of like the nature of how we need to proceed going forward, is to get to know people and connect with them from a very real place that that you develop trust, and you allow them to be able to unravel some of the stuff that they went through on their journey here, or the feeling of feeling powerless, um, even as they are here, but having a community of trust within that time.
Hey, does that resonate with your experience, Mandy?
Oh yes, very much so. That's one of the major, pillars of what I've been talking about this year is that we have to ourselves seek experiences that challenge our perceptions and broaden our perspectives, and we need to provide those opportunities for our students as well. And that starts with being interested in who our kids are and getting to know them and really believing in who they are and their potential, and then encouraging them to see that in one another and in themselves, frankly. So, yes, it very much resonates. And I just want to point out, too, that the rhetoric in our nation right now, or what's being said, is very polarizing. So what we're seeing right now is that things are being drawn down a very specific line. One side of the political ideology sees, America first, and then the other side of the political ideology is about compassion and openness. And I think this is very dangerous. This is a very dangerous way of thinking, because this is manifesting in classrooms, because when teachers are trying to teach lessons about having compassion and being open to different ways of thinking, being, and doing, we're seeing a direct conflict with some students' home lives, where then they come in and they say, oh, well, an educator is pushing some sort of a political agenda because they're trying to get me to be compassionate to other people. And that's, I think, very dangerous, because having compassion shouldn't be on either line. I mean, it shouldn't be like red or blue or Democrat or Republican or conservative or progressive. It should be a universal, because we should be open and compassionate and empathetic and want to get to know all of the people in our communities regardless. And so this is such an interesting time right now, because of that, because we're making things so very like drawing that line.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by how this all plays out in Spokane. I don't know if you saw what I had written, but I have the son of one of my cousins, a young man named Ryan Ulrich, who's 37, works with an organization that is trying to help people through transitions of homelessness, immigrant rights, other things. But he moved to Spokane the age of 18, was coming out as a gay man, realized that this was a community that was still trying to figure out what all this meant. Spokane is very different from Seattle. Eastern Washington, very different from the coast. And one of the things he did early on was establish a shelter for kids who'd been kicked out of their homes. And one of the requirements of staying in the shelter was to do community service. And in that moment, 20-some years ago, I think, attitudes changed in a city in which folks just would have assumed that a more conservative, traditional ethos would apply. But it was the fact that people got to know those kids through Ryan's work. I think that was really powerful. But again, it plays out differently in a city like Spokane maybe than a Seattle or a Madison or other places, because you have both of those threads, what you're talking about in terms of folks who are really thinking that they've got to adhere to the status quo and to tradition and to all these new people, these new ideas are a threat, versus folks who are wanting to embrace something more pluralistic. But I imagine the way it plays out there, though, is very authentic. It's the kind of lesson that the whole nation has to learn. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Because so in Washington State, Spokane is the second largest city, which is often very surprising to people because they automatically assume it's somewhere over on the west side of the state. But it is the second largest city, but it's surrounded by tremendously smaller communities. So what you have is a a large city, urban environment in which people are living side by side. And we're, in a big city, you're kind of forced to live next door to people who maybe are a bit different than you. And I think that lends itself to this more open-mindedness like you're going to see in Seattle. But then you go just a couple of miles out of the city, and you're in a small town where a lot of it is very homogeneous. There's not a whole lot of variety of different people. And so then you start to see that more narrow worldview. So with a constant struggle between Spokane proper and then the outside of Spokane. And so it can, when you have, any kind of movement between the two areas, there's always going to be a struggle of trying to figure out how to live with one another and be open to one another. And so I think that's really your story about your cousin is so important, because that's the whole deal, right? It's exposure. It's exposure and experience and seeing other people and engaging with them that helps you to be open to them.
Pardeep, your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I was just nodding my head again. Mandy, you got it right on that. The national rate of demographic sort of shift that's happening right now is that suburban and urban areas are gaining lots of immigrants and refugees within the population, and outside sort of rural areas are remaining pretty homogenous, and there's that level of disconnect that doesn't happen, and just mere exposure and saying, okay, how do we navigate this going forward? With that said, an awesome psychologist, we talk about people having sort of this growth and fixed mindset. There are people who are geared towards having sort of this fixed mindset of like, I want things to remain the way that they are. And there are other people who have this growth mindset of, I can navigate change. Well, one of the truths in life is that change is going to happen. I would love to think that I'm going to, I know you can't see me over the radio, but, I'm going to be this young forever. But most likely, I'm going to change, we're going to change. And how do we navigate that change going forward? I think is a big question that Mandy, as far as like even her experience within Spokane, speaks on a national, sort of a national dilemma, and something that the politics have really tapped into, and the narrative of fear is the fear is, do you want to lose the way that you live your life to these people? And some people are answering and saying, no, I don't want to lose the way that my life exists to these people, whoever these people are. And then other people are like saying, no, you know what, we have to understand that the truth is that the world and the United States will change, and how do we navigate it so that everybody can change and understand one another.
Mm-hmm.
One aspect I wanted to explore with you. First of all, we should establish context. Part of the reason that there are large numbers of immigrants, I know that Lutheran Social Services there in Spokane has helped facilitate a place of safety for a lot of folks from immigrant populations. But it's fascinating to me, and this is resonant with the work that Pardeep does, which is very much focused on transforming and healing people who are in places of trauma, particularly young people. But one of the things that you do is a map-making project. And as a kid who just loved geography, loved to make maps when I was younger, I just think that's fascinating. But could you describe what that means, how you both are able to position kids into a place of being able to deal with the trauma without re-traumatizing them?
So that's one of the main Spokane, I don't know how do you say that, but of the map making project is this idea that we need to help kids who have gone through a great deal of trauma and adverse experiences in order to come to the United States. And sometimes that can lead to difficulties thinking about where they have come from because it can be so traumatizing or difficult for them. So one of the goals of the Newcomer Center is to help them have positive feelings and to really focus on the positive things that they remember about their communities. And so that's where the map making project came from, because it was kind of a safe, positive way that they could share their home environments where they came from with one another and have pride in their community. So before we explore our community that we live in now, we have the kids draw maps of their neighborhoods back at home and favorite places or things like that. And then they share those with one another. And then we draw a map of our community, the community of our school, and then also the community in which each of the students lives in Spokane. And then we compare those and talk about, if things are shaped differently or the streets are a little bit different or things like that. And we really appreciate the beauty in each environment. And then, of course, we use those maps to practice language, like giving and receiving directions. So.
That's brilliant. As far as like the project itself, it starts from a place of what the students know. So it starts from a very asset-based, beginning, and really allows for a tiered learning approach where you learn from where they already are, where students already are, and then build from that. And for as we speak about the role of pain and trauma and how that sort of sits in our body, that allows for that processing to begin, but not to the point that you overly expose the person that and they're doing what's called a PTSD feedback loop, that's been one of the things that as we look back at the history of even mental health from a diagnostical model, we look at it and say, what we thought about the person was when insurances would bill somebody, they would say, what is wrong with this person? To now basically understanding from a very trauma-informed approach to saying, what happened to you within your lifetime? And those two sort of approaches, the most recent one leading to a sense of that you ask somebody what is wrong or what has happened within their lifetime, you automatically almost assume the ability to do something about it. And that's a very responsible place to be as a society and as an educator. That's just a very brilliant project to, when we talk about it in counseling, we talk about a rubber band, and basically you can try to bend the rubber band, but don't break it, because there's an irresponsibility with that. If you take this person into a place of just going back into this feedback loop, then it becomes even more cemented, and it's harder to unravel all of that. And so we unravel a little bit at a time. Mandy, you're a brilliant educator.
I don't know about that.
And a humble one too. I think what Pardeep is getting at, this is something that came up in a recent show that we did on juvenile justice. The question's never asked, or it isn't asked often enough. What brought you here? What is the life path that took you into, in this case, juvenile justice, or what brought you into a place of trauma? And you really have to go back in and understand the story. Many of the children that you're dealing with in Ferris High School, in the experience in their home countries or their passage to this country, it was a horrible passage, and you have to acknowledge the reality of that, but also allow them places of safety where they can move through that. How do you do that?
Well, in my specific context, I have brand new newcomers, so they've only been in the United States for 3 months or fewer, and they know very little English. And at that point in their transition to living and studying in the United States, it's really important that we don't make them relive any kind of trauma, because they're already going through such tremendous culture shock and possibly post-traumatic stress, and just trying to adjust and to coming to a nation where they probably had these ideas that it was going to be different than it ends up being, because they're just trading they're trading this extreme trauma for a different kind of trauma here in the United States, trying to survive here. Because of the high cost of living and the jobs that oftentimes their families have to take, even though they're they have higher qualifications, and so they're trying to do all that. So for me, at that level, it's very important that I help them focus on positive things, and like Pardeep said, the assets and the strengths that they bring with them. And so that's why we focus on, my favorite place, or this is what my neighborhood looked like, or just the very basic, how did you come to the United States? Not the circumstances, not the trauma, but we got on an airplane in this place, and then we traveled to this place, and it was this time of day, because in that, they can really focus on concrete and positive experiences, as well as practicing very basic language that they'll need to survive here in the United States. And then as they transition out of the Newcomer Center and move on, as they have more experience, learn more language, and become more confident and comfortable, then, we slowly draw out some of those things to help them work through that trauma. But at my stage, we have to keep it positive. We have to keep it really focused on the good, so that they can successfully and confidently transition to living and studying here, and be willing to take risks as they move forward.
Pardeep, can you identify with that?
Oh my God, yes. Yeah. I was, Maddie, I have a book called The Gift of Our Wounds, and I'm not trying to shamelessly plug it, but it's written from a personal standpoint of when I came to this country and how that transition looked. And as you were talking about, as I was writing this book, I had to go back and really relive some of that early sort of trauma that we speak about, and really there's this rejection of character, the rejection of self, the rejection of I don't even want you here, or you're not worth enough. And I think a lot of people struggle with that on a day-to-day basis. At the top of this hour, we were talking about the case of Jesse Smollett and then what happened with him, and sort of the wanting of fame, and how the wanting of fame is actually compensating for this sense of like I'm not enough of something, and how that can even be a very like hard thing to live with. And then yes, like people struggle through that journey all the time, and giving them this place of like, okay, like I look at you with the eyes of complete love and complete value, and just giving them that place. And I'm sure that you walk around the world, and then not that you probably don't even intentionally do it anymore, because the more that you meditate sort of on presence and essence, the more that you become it. And they probably just feel that way when they come in there. And then getting people to a place where you can lovingly challenge their ideas of worth or lack thereof is what we almost have to do as a society when we have children doing things to get attention, or to get you got adults doing things to get attention. But yeah, I think if you can introduce, there is some rough language within the book, because I co-wrote the book with a former white supremacist, and it really explores the coming together of East and West, and just a mindset of work or lack thereof, and but I think with maybe high school or college kids, it could really just kind of help, and they can identify with things within that.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah. What is the book called again?
It's called The Gift of Our Wounds.
The Gift of Our Wounds. I'm going to get it.
Yeah, Pardeep was on national C-SPAN in conjunction with the Wisconsin Book Festival. Has traveled all over the country. I think it's something that's definitely opened up a dialogue about the power and all of that. I'm going to try, we had trouble doing this earlier, but just briefly to bring in the voices of some of the students that you work with through the form of a report that was on the CBS This Morning broadcast on the morning that you were announced. Here we go.
Teacher of the Year. This exceptional educator will spend the next year as an advocate for more than 3 million teachers and 50 million public school students across the country. No small task. This year's winner, we are proud to announce, is Mandy Manning. She was chosen by the nonprofit Council of Chief State School Officers based on her effective work inside the classroom. Mandy teaches English and math to refugee and immigrant students at Joel E. Ferris High School in Spokane, Washington. She is often the first teacher they have when they come to the United States. And we are excited to have Mandy here this morning. But first, we spoke to a number of her former students about her impact.
All right, so we put you in your language groups again because you're going to help each other.
So when I came to her class, I think I only know how to say hi.
I was so nervous. I don't want to talk to people.
Miss Manning taught me confidence.
The class that helped me with a lot that I am today.
I didn't believe I could do it, but she made me believe in myself.
What's your dream? What's your dream?
I always wanted to be a doctor, but she inspired me. She convinced me to do it.
So I am a cosmetologist because of her. I got my first job with her help.
She don't care about where you come from, how your background is. She just helps.
She's still helping me with my difficult assignments.
That's a great message.
Yeah. I feel like what makes her different is like her wanting to be part of the student lives.
She made me feel like, oh, there's someone behind me, which is Miss Manning.
It's just a lot of love.
You want to come back? Yeah. I want you to come back.
So powerful stories shared there. Mandy, as you're reflecting on hearing these stories, we live in this time when a lot of folks are discounting teachers. Here in Wisconsin, Scott Walker, our governor, managed to kind of throw a wedge into that, saying the teachers were overpaid and union rights came up and all kinds of other things. But I would imagine it's got to touch you deeply to hear those testimonials for yourself, but also for your peer teachers to know that these are differences that are significant in the lives of children you serve. And it's really important, I think, for us to embrace the role of teachers in the society.
Yeah. So hearing my students made me a little emotional.
Oh, I'm sure it does.
So, well, one of the main things for kids I hesitate to use the word resiliency. I know we use that a lot because it's kind of a buzzword right now, but I would say that our kids are already extremely resilient. I think what we're really talking about is a student's ability to time travel, which means to be able to see themselves in the future and believe that they can reach that endless potential that all kids have. And one of the major pieces of that is to have relationships with kind, committed, caring adults in their lives outside of their home. And for many kids, that kind, committed, caring adult is their teacher. And this has been shown over and over and over again how essential these kind, caring, committed adults are in ensuring that kids grow up to be the successful, whatever successful is determined to be, but joyful, happy, contributing community members. And so to diminish the role of a teacher, to suggest that a teacher is not an essential piece of a child's life is so sad to me. And then also to just define that role, that teacher role, as someone who delivers learning or someone who delivers content also diminishes what our job really is. And our job is not to teach content. Our job is to empower young people to be lifelong learners, to have that growth mindset that Pardeep talked about, and ultimately to truly believe in themselves. And that's so essential, not only to our young people, but to our society as a whole. And so we need to be respecting and honoring an educator and giving educators the latitude to be able to do those things I just talked about. We have to be able to put our relationships and our connections with our students first in our classrooms, because that relationship is so important to a child's future.
I had a chance to go online and see the application that was made as you were, as folks were nominating for, as you were applying for the Teacher of the Year award, and it was the student stories, of course, that really struck home, that were front and center. Let me jump around just a little bit, but about halfway through the first narrative, you described a student, I believe from the Marshallese student, and that this young man was totally silent for the first couple of weeks he was with you, and put his head down, and you worried about him, and then could you take the story forward from there?
Well, I have so many stories like that, and I haven't looked back at my...
No, that's okay. So essentially you said the unit came along. I think it was the map-making unit.
Oh,
He had to...
Oh, yeah. Okay. So he really was struggling. And I don't know how much you know about Marshallese students, but students from the Marshall Islands often have strong social language skills in English, but they lack literacy usually, so they have a hard time reading and writing in English. So it can fool some teachers, because sometimes the kids will come in and they'll be able to speak English, but then they can't perform because they don't have that academic language foundation. And this student in particular was extremely shy. And so he struggled to participate in class. He wasn't making strong connections with his classmates. But as soon as we started to do this project, he lit up, because it gave him this opportunity to remember life on the island. And he really missed it, is what it turned out, that he was so silent because he was so sad. Because Spokane, I mean, even the weather is drastically different. Even if you just boil it down to that one point,
right,
can make it quite difficult for a student from the islands. And so when he had that opportunity to immerse himself in his experience and his home, he lit up, and he just was able to share. And it was so cool, because from that time on, he was just so much more brave and so much more able to take risks. And from then on, he showed that language that I knew was hiding in there. And then he was able to grow in his literacy skills as well.
And so, how I think on CBS they ask you this question: when your students come and they speak no English, how do you communicate? You were mentioning you have the rather unusual ability to speak both Armenian and Japanese, but it doesn't necessarily give you the capacity to communicate with others. But it fascinates me in ESL settings and other things. How do you begin to communicate?
Well, I'm lucky because I happen to have a classroom full of students that are basically at the same level in their English.
Okay.
So they're just starting out. I'm also lucky in that all of my students usually come from different nations, so their common language is English. And so in order, all kids want to connect with other kids. Like, that's just real thing. It's universal. And so in order to connect, they have to be able to communicate with one another. So there's already that intrinsic motivation to learn language. So it's easy to build from that. It's easy to build from when kids have the desire to actually learn.
Yeah.
And then just in general, there's so many ways that we communicate with each other that doesn't involve words. We use images. We use the way that our facial expressions, our gestures. There's so many ways that we communicate that aren't out loud. And so I use all of those things with my students. And there's nothing that can, just the whole idea that I'm going to look at my kids, I'm going to reach out and make some sort of a contact with them and really be there with them. Just doing that alone helps them to connect with me, and then helps them to be willing to try language that might be a little scary at first.
I think you're kind of alluding to this, but I mean, is there an expression in the arts that's maybe useful here? Just a flashback to my cousin Ryan. One of the things that he's famous for in Spokane is he makes these enormous balloon sculptures. So he will have like a 2-scale Tyrannosaurus Rex that he puts in the mall there. Or early in his life, he had made a 3-story house in the mall that he broadcast around the world on the internet and then raised money for Habitat for Humanity. But but Ryan, in his own struggles as a gay man, I think art and expression of art in the world was something really important to him. Is that true for some of your kids, both in the GSAs and the immigrant kids you work with?
Oh, yeah, for sure. We are always using art in the classroom because it's a way of expressing yourself, drawing pictures. That is a way to communicate.
Absolutely. Pardeep, again, resonate with your own experience?
Oh, yeah, it does. Part of our project, and that's we were running Serve to Unite, was really about using arts-based programming to process through a lot of issues of mental health and trauma. So it's like Mandy said, it's a great way of expressing yourself and expressing and addressing some of those issues that of mental health.
I have a niece who was raised by 2 moms, and I became part of her household after I came out about 30-some years ago. And she founded a group called Proud Theater for LGBT kids, but kids of color and kids from diversity of experience, I think, get a lot out of this. They get together on a Wednesday night. They make improv, great skits about things. But as she became an adult and was traveling in East Africa or in Palestine, she would take workshops and for example, in the West Bank of Palestine, she would have the kids ages 8 to 16 come up with skits that were resonant with their lives. And I guess the best way to describe it is there'd be skits about memorials and funerals to people that they'd lost, but these were skits that were also filled with laughter and with joy. Again, is drama also maybe a tool that helps transform and bring kids through these incidents, Mandy?
Can you repeat that?
So I'm just wondering, I don't know if you heard the context of it, but I have a niece that uses drama as a technique for achieving catharsis for kids who are facing trauma. Is that something also?
Yeah, it is. In the Newcomer Center, it's more limited because we're focusing on the positive. But I have used my very first year teaching. I actually taught theater, and one of the units that we did was doing one-act plays, and the kids got to choose their one act, and then they were an ensemble, and they got to perform it. And all the kids chose one-act plays that would help them deal with various experiences that are common to most teenagers. So there was one about bullying. There was one about a prom situation that involved a traumatic situation on a date. And so it was really cool to watch the kids and to really see how that how they were able to express some of those emotions that they'd been holding in. And so I think that there's a lot of value in drama and the use of role play.
So one of the other things you talked about in the application was the narrative begins in 2016. Our school and district began to have discipline issues we'd never experienced before. Elementary teachers were evacuating classrooms due to violent students. Students were running away. And a group of girls at one middle school calls the entire school to go on to lockdown. So you needed to put this in perspective to the immigrant students that you were working with. And there was something you mentioned that Ferris was one of the first schools to use something called positive behavior intervention systems. Could you tell a little bit of that story?
So this is the whole idea of using restorative practices, which is embedded within positive behavior intervention systems. And this is the idea that we should have conversations and we should help kids process discipline situations. And it's hard because we use the word discipline, which has a very different connotation than what is intended. So when you're talking about restorative practices, you're talking about a situation happens, and you're helping each participant within that situation process that experience, and then come back together to have a restorative conversation to hopefully increase a connection between the individuals involved in the situation, and then prevent that situation from happening. So it's a much better, more positive system than a consequence-based system where you're suspending kids or putting them in detention or in-school suspension, things like that. And so at the time when we went through that whole process of reassessing and redeveloping our plan, there had been some issues that were disproportionately impacting our students of color, which not at my level, because I don't often have any kind of discipline issues within the Newcomer Center because they're so new and transitioning, and it's just a very different environment. But as kids go through the system and leave the Newcomer Center and go out into mainstream classes, it can disproportionately impact our immigrant and refugee students, simply because as a society we have biases that we really need to face. And our systems of discipline often, statistically you can look, are oppressive to our students of color. And so we worked together as a team to revamp that discipline process so that it could be more restorative, so that it would decrease the number of suspensions, and ultimately it would not negatively impact my students as they went through the system after the Newcomer Center. So the key, though, to that experience was not just this idea of, oh, we need to do restorative practices now, but rather ensuring that every single stakeholder within our building had a say in what happened. Because it turns out, I know this is going to be shocking, but oftentimes we have systems in place that that not everybody knows what their rights and responsibilities are.
Right.
And oftentimes as well, we overlook certain roles within a school building, like nutrition services or custodial staff, who also are impacted by discipline in the school, but we usually just don't, hear their voice or include them in the process. And so that was a big step, is we included every single group within our school in the process of developing the new plan so that we could address everybody's needs and concerns. And then at the end of the day, everybody would know what their responsibility was within the plan. And it did result in a significant decrease in the number of suspensions in that first year. So since then, I've been traveling, so I don't have my finger on the pulse of how it's been going, but
Sure.
I've been assured that it is still going, and there's bumps in the road, but it's intended to be a fluid and flexible process because our school community is fluid and flexible. It changes all the time.
We're down to our last few minutes, but there was one other theme in the application. You said your students come from all over the world: Syria, Micronesia, Iraq, Afghanistan, Guatemala, Myanmar, Sudan, Mexico, Tanzania. But anyway, that they're rooted in their own cultures, but they don't know necessarily a lot about their peers' cultures and come with a lot of bias and ideas about those other groups. So, how has it been important for your students to learn from each other in that regard? Is that something that also transfers out into the larger student body? Have they been enriched by learning about the life stories, the cultures of the students that have been part of this program?
Yes, it's essential. I mean, that goes back to what we were talking about before, about the seeking experiences that challenge our perceptions and broaden our perspectives. The more that kids can learn about each other and where they come from, the more able they are to be compassionate and open to different people, and they gain skills and tools to reach across difference. And ultimately, that's so important to our society because we are always going to be living alongside people who are different from us. And so the more that we can practice and the more that we can expose our students to each other's cultures, the more open they are and the more able they are to collaborate and connect and communicate and work with one another. This is particularly important for students born in the United States. So does it go outside of my classroom? Absolutely, it has to, because Pardeep talked about that growth mindset versus fixed mindset, and we need to have that growth mindset. We need to be able to not only recognize the difference, but also learn from difference and celebrate it and recognize the benefits of difference. And so, yeah, I mean, and especially now, because we are getting so many messages that difference isn't good.
Yeah.
When in reality, our communities are the way they are because of difference. The communities are strong and are beautiful and are all of the good things because of difference.
Pardeep, we need to let Mandy get on down the road here, but any last thoughts or questions for her?
Yeah, I agree with completely with Mandy, and the relationship is definitely reciprocal. Forbes 500 really called out the notion of cultural agility, they called it. But it's basically this ability to be able to navigate different cultures and not just tolerate, but to embrace. Mm-hmm. And I think that is the biggest strength that we have within this country. We can look at research and talk about how urban settings within Michigan, within Milwaukee even, are being rebuilt by the immigrant and refugee populations. And these cities are thriving. And the relationship is reciprocal between the culture that exists in domination, and the culture that are coming in within those cultures to strengthen that. And then as far as I think about the education that Mandy imparts within peers of different coming from different countries, and as this education is imparted, they learn something very important, and that they can teach us, which is the world is not just completely about us. And that basically means is that maybe it's not about the country that you live in, maybe it's not about just the place that you live in or your people, but maybe it's about all people and all countries, and we have to find a way to be able to embrace one another. And I think with those programs, and really I think the PBIS strategy, positive behavior intervention and support strategy, really lends itself to embracing that culture of how do we move in this space together, move forward together. I thank you, Mandy, for the work that you do, and then the work that you're going to be called on to do. You're going to be on the road quite a bit, and just to have you as an ambassador to education, and it's just a beautiful thing.
Mandy, we do need to let you go, but just last thoughts on what this journey has meant for you, what you've learned along the way from other people.
Well, I think that the biggest thing for me has been the ability to have a platform to empower other people, because we're often told as educators that we need to stay in our classroom, that we need to focus on our content, that it's not our responsibility to speak out about anything that relates to kids. For example, child detention. I don't know, I have this organization called Teachers Against Child Detention, which speaks out against the imprisonment of immigrant children simply because they were born outside of the United States. And I think that it has shown me that as educators, it is our responsibility to not only advocate for the kids in our classrooms, but for all kids. And that as educators, we are positioned to speak out for injustices against any child, and that it frankly is our responsibility. And so that's been tremendously empowering, and then also to have that to empower other educators and give them space to also speak out has been really tremendous.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I hope to go see my cousin Ryan out west before too long, and would love to introduce you. And he has heard you speak on a number of occasions. Very inspired, of course, about the work you're doing. But anyway, thanks so much for the connection. We're really glad to have you here in Madison, especially in the context of the Peace Corps. Clearly, again, in this example of how we learn from each other across the world. And anyway, thank you again so much.
Thank you so much.